Hello and welcome to Becoming What God Intended Ministries and Ephesus Group Ministries webinar event. My name is Gail Encarnation and I will be your event host for today's webinar, part one of a three-part series on marriage, divorce, and remarriage by Dr. David Eckman.
We are going to do together a survey of the Old and New Testament concerning marriage, divorce, and remarriage. It will be in three parts. The first part, this portion, will deal with the Old Testament. The second part will deal with the Gospels and Jesus Christ's perspective on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And then the third part will summarize the first two and then present Paul's perspective on divorce and remarriage. And so we'll be covering the spectrum because when we approach the issue of marriage and divorce, to truly understand what the Bible is saying, we have to look at a survey of it and recognize that the Old Testament is interacting with the Gospels are interacting with the epistles, and when you look at the flow in a unity, it makes good sense as to how each portion of Scripture addresses these issues. We're going to start with the first couple, and that is Adam and Eve in Genesis 1. We obviously all know the creation account. A world was prepared for humanity, and a couple was placed upon it. Then God said, "Let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness." And the image is how they physically present themselves. The likeness is what they are in their interior life. The couple will be a representation of the divine. There'll be an analogy of the divine, physical analogies of the divine. Let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule, in order that they might rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth. God wanted great rulers, so He chose to make the rulers in His own image. He chose to make them male and female. Verse 27 points that out. God created humanity in His own image, and in the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. And verse 27 is interesting because it places the creation of the male first, then brings in the female second, but together they comprise humanity. Together they comprise the image and likeness of God. Not just Adam. Adam alone is an incomplete image, is not a complete mirror of what divinity is like. And notice, let us make humanity. One member of the Trinity is speaking to a second member of the Trinity, and then two people are created, matching those two members of the Trinity. All through Scripture, Old and New Testament, thus Father and Son speak together, while it is the Holy Spirit who takes the words of the Father and Son and apply them to our lives. We can presume that it was a conversation between two at this point, and two showed up. So we can also presume that a man and a woman in a lifetime covenant is the intention of God. That's a marriage. A man and a woman in a lifetime covenant fulfilling the great purposes of God. We're going to step over, though, to the book of Deuteronomy, where the Old Testament law concerning divorce is given. And that law is fascinating for what it says and what it does not say. The Old Testament divorce law is fully presented in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. And it is presented from the male perspective, and in the context of the Old Testament, that makes sense, because Israel was an ancient Near Eastern culture. It was patriarchal, and its world revolved around the male. Verse 1 states, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor or grace in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a scroll or certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband, the second husband, turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, the second husband, who took her to be his wife, then," sounds complicated, doesn't it? "Then her former husband, her first husband, who sent her away, is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled." And we'll talk about what this means in detail in a little bit. "For that is an abomination, a horrific thing before the Lord," before Yahweh, which is the personal name of God in the Old Testament. "And if you permit this, you shall not bring sin on the land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance." Verses 1 through 4. Notice it presumes divorces occur. Notice it presumes the husband initiates the divorce. And notice that it's very careful to point out that the man who initiates the divorce has no right to treat his former wife like it's a game of ping pong, where she can simply come back to him again. Seriousness is invested into the decision by how this is written. Now, let's take a look at the parts. First, the phrase, "that she finds no favor in his eyes." Hebrew word is gone. It is the most common Greek word for gracious. Graciousness means the person freely grants favor because the individual loves and cares for and wants to nourish. And out of that love, he's more than happy to be gracious in attitude. But this man, this husband, has no grace. This word gone is used frequently of God's grace and favor. Now, as commentary on this, in the New Testament, Jesus is asked in Matthew 19 about Moses commanding a certificate or scroll of divorce. The Pharisees, the rabbis, asked Jesus concerning that. And Jesus responds in verses 7 and 8. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate or scroll of divorce and send her away?" Now, he commanded the scroll. He did not command sending her away. He, Jesus, said to them, "Because of your," notice it doesn't say his, "but because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you," did not command, "permitted you to divorce your wives." He's referring to the Israelite nation. That's why it's plural. "But from the beginning, it has not been this way. The intention was a unit of two throughout their lives. But this was a matter of permission, first of all, because of a lack of graciousness in the husband. The next phrase in the text is, he has found some indecency in her. In a clearer translation of that text, he actually, quote, finds a thing of nakedness or shame that repulses him. That's actually the lexicon or Hebrew language definition of that word. There is something of private shame that he finds repulsive. And he doesn't have a graciousness of a heart, a graciousness within his heart to tolerate that thing of nakedness or shame. The expression, a thing of nakedness, was typically used for sexual intimacy in the Old Testament. Leviticus 18:6 plus 18 other times. And also used of defecation, indecent defecation, Deuteronomy 23:15. Obviously something private. Most likely in Deuteronomy 24:1, the phrase refers to an offense in the intimacy of marriage that cannot be publicly discussed or even proved. But there's two elements being described here. Something offensive between the two of them in the privacy of their life. And then secondly, a lack of graciousness on the husband's fault, on the husband's part. He is commanded to give her a scroll or certificate of divorce. Even today, that is the custom among Orthodox Jews. A scroll that is very formulaic, is written out, the blanks are filled in, and a messenger is sent to the wife saying, "It's over, be on your way." This certificate of divorce is something that is traditional among the Jews, and it's a critically important aspect of this. If he's going to send her away, he has to create a legitimate document that says, first of all, that she's divorced. But with this document, the assumption is that she can remarry. She's legitimately divorced, and she can legitimately remarry. And this entire section actually deals with her right of remarriage and how the husband, the first husband, cannot interfere with her life after he has sent her out the door. What's important to notice, and it's often overlooked, is this entire portion, even though it's written from the male perspective, is for the protection of the female. Notice, if you will, and again, this is often overlooked, and quite frankly, I would say shockingly overlooked. That thing of indecency is something within the privacy of marriage. This thing of indecency is not adultery or fornication. We can be absolutely sure of that. Why? Because in the Old Testament, if you were a fornicator, that is, you involved yourself in an illicit sexual intercourse with somebody who was not married and you were not married, the biblical solution in the Old Testament for that was a heap of stones and you were underneath it. Divorce was not an option. Stoning was. And it was also the same for adultery. In Leviticus 20:10, for instance, if there is a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, one who commits adultery with his friend's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. That is not a divorce law. That is a penalty for an infraction of God's Old Testament law. We can say very clearly, almost mathematically, this divorce law in Deuteronomy chapter 24 cannot be addressing fornication or adultery. Then also in Deuteronomy 22:21, 2 chapters before chapter 24, speaking of fornication, a young woman who is involved in an illicit sexual relationship. Then they shall bring out the girl to the doorway of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death, because she has committed an act of folly in Israel, by playing the harlot in her father's house. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. Now, in the modern world, stoning is abhorrent. But that's not what we're emphasizing. We're talking about the ancient divorce law and what it had to be addressing and what it absolutely was not addressing. And it was not addressing matters of fornication and adultery. Tremendously important. Because what it means then is that the Old Testament had a pretty lenient law of divorce. Quite frankly, the husband could not even have to say what is the reason. Because in the scroll of divorce, he simply had to say he has sent her away, she is no longer his wife, and she has the right of remarriage legitimately. And that's it. The cause, the offense, is never stated. But her right of remarriage is underscored. And her right of not having her later life interfered with by her first husband is underscored in the strongest imaginable Hebrew terms and in the strongest imaginable terms of abhorrence in the Old Testament. Taking the wife back by the first husband was called by Moses an abomination. Her former husband, who sent her away, is not allowed to take her again to be his wife. Deuteronomy 24, verse 4 says, since she has been defiled. It is assuming there was something that was offensive to the husband, that it was something of significance to the husband, maybe not to the next husband, but to that husband. But for him to take her back, that is declared to be an abomination, a to'avah. A to'avah is literally a thing of hatred. It is the term which is used in the Old Testament when God absolutely abhors something. So that in the strongest possible terms, once this man makes up his mind, he cannot retrace it. That's very helpful because it grants true freedom to the wife. Now, the statement about being defiled means that she's unclean. She's unclean as far as the first husband is concerned, but she's totally clean and acceptable as far as the second husband is concerned. And taking her back is an abomination before Yahweh, and then the people are told, you shall not bring sin, this particular sin, on the land. Notice again the strength of the statement. Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4, is referred to one other place in the Old Testament very powerfully. The prophet Jeremiah uses that law to illustrate God's relationship to Judah. The nation is in rebellion. The nation is committing spiritual adultery. And he says this in Jeremiah 3:1. If a husband divorces his wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will she still return? Will he still return to her? Will not that land be completely polluted, unclean, if that occurs? Then Jeremiah turns to the nation of Judah, the people of God, and he says, but you, all of you are a harlot with many lovers, yet you turn to me, declares Yahweh. Jeremiah quotes that to say there is permanence in what is done in that marriage, and God himself should not be treated like he's a yo-yo in the same way this woman in Deuteronomy 24 should not be treated like she is a yo-yo. We see the extent of that law. I think it's important to remember, again, it doesn't involve adultery, doesn't involve fornication. It involves a private matter, and that private matter could be, frankly, pretty unimportant. So in summary, the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law of divorce, is loose, not very tight at all. Now there's one more portion in the Old Testament we want to look at, because this will have implications for the epistles and for the Apostle Paul. Remember, this talk is all about background, Old Testament background, so that we can understand what Jesus is talking about, and so that we can also appreciate what Paul is going to address when it comes to Gentile Christian marriages. In Ezra 10, Ezra and Nehemiah have come back with the people of Judah from the Babylonian captivity. If you know your Old Testament history, in 586, Jerusalem was burned down, 586 BC. The people were sent off to the Babylonian captivity, and then after 70 years they started returning. Nehemiah, the governor, returned. Ezra, a priest who became the lawgiver like Moses to the people, returned. And Ezra ran into a tremendous problem. There was intermarriage between the people, particularly the men who returned, and the wives of the Gentiles in the land of Judea. There was tremendous intermarriage, particularly among the priests and the leaders. And so in the face of that, Ezra demanded a mass divorce right across the board. He viewed what they were doing as a threat to the existence of Judah. Now the irony that is that many famous Israelites, like King David, took Gentile wives. But Ezra is not concerned about that. His mentality is, if this goes on, the nation ceases to be Jewish, to be Israelite. So in Ezra 10, all the people are gathered. So all the men of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within the 3 days that Ezra summoned them. All the people sat in the open square. It was raining. It was cold. Before the house of God, before the temple, trembling because of this matter. They knew something very heavy was coming, and the heavy rain. Verse 10, then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, you have been unfaithful and have married foreign wives, adding to the guilt of Israel. Now therefore, make confession to Yahweh, God of your fathers, and do his will, and you are ordered to separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives. And there was a mass divorce. This is a very important section. It's not important in the Gospels, but it becomes quite important in the epistles with the Apostle Paul. So what are the issues that we need to think about? First of all, divorce in the Old Testament law was because of a husband's hard-heartedness or lack of grace. And secondly, the discovered indecency or area of unacceptability in the eyes of the husband. That set a very low standard for divorce. Jesus in the Gospels will address that. And then the second thing we need to file away as we proceed to the next two talks is the divorce of the non-Israelite non-believer. Now, what Ezra did was actually pretty radical in the Old Testament. Think about this. Boaz, in the book of Ruth, if he followed Ezra's approach, would have to divorce Ruth, one of the finest figures of faith in the Old Testament. Tamar, the prostitute of Jericho, who rescued the tribes and married an Israelite man, would have to be put away, even though she is an example of faith. Paul particularly addresses this issue. And so that is a summary, and that is what we want you to think about. And following this, you can watch part 2 that deals with Jesus' redoing of the Old Testament law and his interpretation of the Old Testament law. And then following that will be part 3, which will summarize these talks and look at Paul's perspective on a mixed marriage, on a Christian Gentile or Christian non-believer marriage. Thank you for watching.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ekman, for your captivating talk on divorce and what divorce really is about. It's certainly not what we find today. Otherwise, with adultery left and right, I think half the population would be dead at this point. So thank you for clarifying the biblical truth about divorce. And at this time, we do have some questions from the audience that I'd like to ask you, if that's okay.
Good. Love to.
Sure. So the first question's from Tommy, and you spoke about how easy it is for the man to just go ahead and decide to divorce the woman. Well, what about the woman's right to divorce the man? Is that an opportunity that the woman can take advantage of?
Okay. Now, again, we have to presuppose that this is the Old Testament. This is the ancient Near East. This is not California 2012 or 13. This is the ancient world. Mm-hmm. And in the ancient world, Israel was part of that ancient world so that males had to initiate divorce. Mm-hmm. Although, quite frankly, if the husband turned out to be a criminal, or if he turned out to be a cheat, if he turned out to be an adulterer, the community would address that issue. But the wife would not be able to initiate the divorce. So in a sense, Tommy is asking a modern question. Mm-hmm. In the Old Testament, there is no indication that the wife initiated divorce. However, it's a reality that that wife's honor was very important to the wife's family and clan, so that in a healthy, functioning tribal system, if the husband mistreated her, he would have to deal with a family and an extended clan that would feel dishonored by the way he had treated her. But again, we are not talking about California circa 2012.
Right, and that's sometimes very difficult for us to do, is put ourselves back in the time of the Old Testament. So the next question here is from Art. Art, thank you for your question. Art's question is, the Old Testament presentation deals with divorce from a male point of view. What if the wife originates the divorce, which often happens today? And there's a follow-up question to that. When can the man remarry?
Oh my goodness. Well, the answer to that's real simple. Wait till talk 2 and talk 3. And we'll leave it at that, because I'd have to give talk 2 and 3 to be able to adequately answer his question. So Art, come back.
So the next question is from Christine. Thank you. During the Old Testament times, would a wife who is divorced lose her rights to her children in the first marriage?
As far as the pattern of the Old Testament is concerned, the wife loses her right to those children because the way the genealogies worked, they worked through the husband. And the assumption is that the wife is having children for the husband. It is quite different than the modern world. And within a context, within an ancient context, where it was critically important to preserve the lines of the family, clan, and tribe, it makes sense within that context. Within a modern context, it's whatever the judges decide.
Okay, great question, Christine. Thank you. This next question is from Art again. Art, hopefully he can get your answer this time and not have to wait for part 2. So Art's question is, death for fornication or adultery was severe. What was the sin involved?
What was the sin involved?
Let me give you the second part
Yeah,
of this
part
question.
2 might help.
Or was this an economic protection because they had no fund to help single-parent families?
Now, again, Art is looking at this from the modern world's perspective. The sin involved is, now we've got to project ourselves back, actually 3,500 years. And the reality is that there was no birth control. So sooner or later, a baby was going to be born. That baby would be illegitimate. It would cause total chaos within the family, tribe, and clan. And the ramifications were immense. And out of that could spring blood feuds very easily. Because, for example, in the book of Genesis, when there was a rape that occurred with one of the daughters of Jacob, the brothers slaughtered an entire community. The culture took it seriously. The ramifications were huge in the ancient world. Today, in a sense, we're buffered because of birth control and abortion. So the crime involved was illegitimate intercourse with a total disruption of that young woman's life, with a total disruption not only of her life, but of the family, clan, and tribe. And simply the act of intercourse outside of marriage is viewed as a capital crime in the Old Testament. Part 2 will talk about the radical change concerning the death penalty that Jesus introduced, but the sin was illegitimate intercourse.
Thanks, Art, again for your question. When someone commits adultery, the penalty is death.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you compare that with the ease of a man opting for divorce, why is there such a discrepancy there in
the law?
In the law, yes.
In the law. That's an important question, and your question actually underscores the purpose of the law is for the protection of the woman. It is essentially saying the guy's a jerk who created the scroll of divorcement. And to protect her, the reason for the divorce is not put in the scroll. So she is not publicly humiliated and becomes damaged second-rate goods. It's just divorce. And they assume it's a private matter and they leave it at a private matter. then secondly, he cannot come chasing after her at his whim. So she's protected on two levels. Her reputation is protected, and she's protected from an ungracious man who may really be coming up with any old flagrant excuse of a divorce. So the lightness of the reason for divorce, in a sense, is for the protection of women from hard-hearted guys. It is a law for the protection of women. It is not a law for the arbitrary rights of the man. It's the protection of the woman from the arbitrary exercise of choice by the man. Very important. Again, the ancient Near East and Israel assumed that the male was the initiator. It was a patriarchal society, unashamedly so. But this is a great example of God's true compassion for the powerless by giving that particular law. Good question.
Great. Thank you. Well, that's all we have time for today. We thank you, Dr. Ekman, for your insight and sharing more about divorce. We hope that you could join us next month, the second Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for part 2 of this 3-part series on divorce, marriage, and remarriage by Dr. Ekman.
And we continually have these webinars month after month after month.
That's right.
And the portions will be put on YouTube, and the program will be going on regularly on the web.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. We thank you for visiting our webinar, and we want to mention to you our website, whatgodintended.com. whatgodintended.com, and there you can find resources for life and for marriage. For example, under the Deepen section of our website, you can find the book Healthy Relationships, plus other books and materials and videos and audio material that will help you in your Christian life and in your relationships. Thank you.